Okay, so for the recording, this is the third session. It's October 29th. We're going to be doing assessment service delivery for the first hour. We will take a break and then we'll do access for the second hour. If you haven't muted yourself, go ahead and mute yourself so that we can hear the content. I'm going to wait for, we'll catch you if you're not muting. We'll mute for you. Who just arrived? We need you to mute yourself. We're getting a lot of background noise. Thank you. Okay, so assistive technology assessment. The learning outcomes for this is identify the steps in an assistive technology assessment and identify appropriate goals and outcome measures for an intervention. Why is an assessment important? So we know that we all want to get it right. We know that we have limited time and resources to work with an individual, and we all know that wrong solutions lead to poor outcomes, frustration, and even reduced function, efficiency, or medical status. When I talk to my team about the assessment and the referral process, we oftentimes are getting referrals that it's more my schedulers are saying, well, what exactly do they want? A lot of times the providers that are sending us the referrals, and sometimes even the consumers, they really can't explain what it is that they need. I feel like if I get an assessment for assistive technology, that is kind of the umbrella, and I'm happy to get them in, and that's when I start triaging what it is. Now, from a scheduling standpoint, if you need to know clearly, is it a language issue? Because maybe you need your speech therapist. Is it a communication as far as a computer access? Is it work related? Is it smart clinic related? You can have categories as far as the scheduling, but when you actually do the assessment, you're really not going to know until that person is in front of you. So it gets your interviewing skills really, really prompt. If you're not in a clinical setting and you're in a classroom, you may be dependent upon multiple different teachers or resources that think they may know what the solution is, but may not know how to specifically get it done. So one of the cautions is whenever somebody comes in with a solution, I'm always like, well, let's keep that in mind, but let's back up and fully understand what problems that you have so that we know what problem we're trying to solve. The limited time and resources, depending on where your service delivery is, and I'm coming from a clinic standpoint, historically, we always had an assumption that we had to do everything in one visit. Well, we're seeing that change, and I'm sorry. I'm just trying to see if there's a hand up. No, Heather, go ahead and let me know if there's a hand up, because that's where I get in my mode. So I just lost my train of thought. So, we can't do everything in one visit. Sometimes we may need to, but the longer we take to understand the problem, the more successful we are in the solution. And I have some algorithms later to show you this. So okay. So if you think about common reasons for equipment abandonment, it's because the equipment didn't meet the goals of the individual or the family caregivers. Sometimes the individual doesn't have the skills that are needed, and sometimes the either consumer had unrealistic needs or the team had unrealistic needs. And so this is where stopping and thinking, what problem are we trying to solve and whose problem is it? If it's the team's problem, but the consumer is invested, then that's one set of challenges. But if it's the consumer wants something, but maybe there's no funding, then that's another area where I've had to step back and say, well, you don't meet the funding criteria, but do you have any alternate funding that we can help you get that? So I've learned to try to not let funding dictate the solution, but the reality is you have to respect the funding and you have to work within the confinements of it in order to help that individual. And that is something that I've had to shift in my thinking. Go to the next slide. Other reasons for abandonment is the person's motivation. The person may be intimidated by the technology, and maybe their needs or functions have changed. So as far as the motivation, again, if they were not, I'm looking at Olga. 1 second, I'll get to that. If the consumer doesn't think that there's a problem, then that's where there might be them not invested. If the consumer has maybe some complications or secondary issues inherent to their disease process, maybe they have apathy, maybe with, like we saw with the stroke, some type of strokes have poor judgment. Maybe they don't have the insight to be able to understand how they can help them. And so motivation sometimes can get misinterpreted, and we read people's behavior, we think they're not motivated, but maybe they don't understand, or maybe they're intimidated by it. So breaking things down and really trying to read the individual and see what it is that is resistant to them. Does anywhere have unlimited time and resources? I mean, obviously no, but sometimes when there's grant-funded programs, they may not be under the gun as much as if you have to meet certain productivity standards. You know, unlimited resources. Sometimes we think the VA has unlimited resources, but you know, clearly we're all in this area where we're all trying to scrutinize what we have. Does funding begin on day one with the referral and intake? So I think of funding, Olga, and yes, I think of funding for the clinician to gather the assessment, to collect information, to write the justification. And then I think of funding also as what is the person eligible for. So I'm assuming you, and feel free to unmute yourself, Olga. I assume that maybe you're thinking about the clinical assessment. Do you still have that question, Olga?
Well, I just want a clear understanding numerically about when the funding begins. I mean, I know that in reality, people can get disqualified, but I want to know in terms of the official AT line, Resna line, is that actually begin and you continue the assessment even if there isn't funding, because you're going to hope that some funding source will become available?
So you're thinking that if I get a referral, I'm going to make an extreme example. I have something called HCAP, which is a hospital funding for someone that's on poverty. So they approve clinical services within the hospital. But that person, as soon as I see they have HCAP, I know there's no funding for the equipment. And so if your question is where do you continue with your clinical assessment knowing that there isn't funding? I would say yes, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to look into where can I get this? Can I look at loan closets? Can I look at any donations? I will, once I identify what it is that I need, then I look for the funding. Does that help answer?
Yeah, I'm just mostly wanted for the exam, when it actually begins, and you know, I'm assuming it's ongoing because of whatever modifications and maintenance needs to get done. So I'm assuming it's ongoing, but
yeah, I have a slide that is one of my favorite slides in here that talks about the service delivery process. Can we come back to your question on that slide? I want to make sure that I understand it. I think I can answer that question then.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, and if you know the other challenges, we have a lot of different areas. If you're a school-based therapist, you don't bill for what you're doing, but you have to, cover your time. Private practice therapists really want to cover all their time because that's how they make the money. So I see George in the school system. We do AT evals and make recommendations, mostly on wheelchairs, and then find funding afterwards. The recommendations help to know. Exactly. So it helps you start navigating where you want to go. And, I always like to say that don't let funding dictate you, but the reality is you have to know what is available, because you can, recommend a house in France and there's no funding for it. So that's not helping anybody. So that's a really great question. And we're going to come back to that under the service delivery model. Other reasons for equipment abandonment is inadequate training on the device. So somebody may be distributed a piece of device, but they didn't have training, or they thought that they knew what the training was, but they became frustrated and stopped using it. And I, again, want to talk about that on the service delivery. Person's embarrassed to use it. And so looking at, where they want to use it, and maybe asking questions about how comfortable they are. And that might help. I don't feel like I see that a ton, but it's more, maybe it's the word embarrassed that's catching me, that maybe they're just not bought into it. And maybe it's an adjustment issue. Maybe they're just not ready because accepting of the disease process. And let's see, is there any conflict-free assessments in AT? So I think it probably means what you mean by conflict-free. In my world, I work for it's Ohio State University Medical Center, so it's an academic state-based facility, and they hover over us with the word conflict. So I can't I cannot do an assessment on somebody that is a family member, because they consider that a conflict. I can't make a recommendation if I have any family members that work for these companies, because they feel like that's a conflict of interest. And I also can't sell it or have any type of buy-in from it. So, instance, I can't accept gifts from any of the vendors, because they may say that that's inducement. Well, you're doing the evals because they're going to send you to a conference. So there's a lot of different ways my organization defines conflict. So I don't know if that answers your question. Seems like all the providers also do the assessments. So I'm going to use the word provider there as maybe the wheelchair supplier or the manufacturer of a communication device. I think the challenge that we're faced is that we have such a limited amount of professionals that have the knowledge in assisted technology. When you go into rural areas, it's hard to find clinicians that maybe have the expertise. So you end up having providers that have to guide and train some clinicians. So with the Code of Ethics, it's, you are held to standards that you should not be, you should not be crossing the line in what your assessment is, and you need to keep your role of a ATP provider, supplier in line. I find, I'm a clinician, so I find my clinician colleagues, when they cross over to become salespeople, it's really hard to shut off that clinical brain. But bottom line, with our Code of Ethics, you have to be aware of when that line is crossed. But as we're getting more and more professionals in this area, and more clinics or helping people get to where that assessment needs to be done, maybe we have less risk of providers doing the assessment. So then back to another reason for equipment abandonment is the person has low self-esteem. So again, it's maybe their readiness for accepting it, being willing to, ready to use the equipment. So when we go into service delivery models for assistive technology, we look at different kind of theories and pathways of what draws us into this area, and how do we approach certain things. So these are 4 service delivery models, and these are 4 areas that are easily studied when you look at preparing for ATP. For instance, this is where I would take the textbook that you get and go back and review the definition of all of them. In assistive technology, we primarily use the human activity assisted technology, or the HAT model. In the school system, it's very similarly called the student environment, task, and tools. So we are going to talk about the HAT model, but there's a lot of correlations to that with the STEP model in the school system. We are not going to go into the feature matching person technology and the education tech points. We simply want to show you that there's 4 service delivery models, and we're going to feature 2 of them. You know, in the title of feature matching, you want to make sure that you are picking the features that that person needs, and the technology has the abilities of what that person's needs are. And then the education tech points is more embedded in the education model, and it goes through the series of how some of those technologies are evaluated. So we're going to spend several slides looking at the HAT model. So as I said, it defines the human activity assisted technology model, and it's a framework to understand the place of assisted technology in the place of people with disabilities. The 4 components are the human, the activity, and then the technology. And the 4th, so human is 1, activity and technology is 3. And then the 4th one is a context. Let me see this question. For the exam, the questions related to equipment, let's say for motorized wheelchair, it will be considered the funding to decide the functions to add on to the wheelchair. For example, lift function on the wheelchair is not a medical necessity, but helps the client to be independent. We will recommend it no matter what we know it won't be covered. Right, the exam is not based as far as, they're not going to say Medicare doesn't carry titanium, or seat elevators are not funded, but they're going to say the purpose of what you need that elevator for. So that is an example of feature matching. So feature matching is I need a seat elevator to conduct these characteristics, and it does not go into funding at all. So understanding the why, and I tell you what, I'm kind of repeating myself, but I love those position papers. Those position papers really break down and help you understand the context of why a decision is made for certain features for the wheelchairs in particular. Okay, so HAT model. We talked about assistive technology. We talked about the activity. We talked about the person, and this is the context. So when you're working with someone and you get a referral, let's say they already have a piece of equipment. So they have a piece of equipment, but they don't understand the function. So if you go back to inadequate training, so you have somebody that just doesn't understand how to use it. So there might be abandonment because one of these needs is not being met. Where I thought you were going with the power wheelchair is, if you get somebody a power wheelchair, but you didn't think about the context of where they're going to use it, maybe the context is their home is not accessible, or maybe the context is that family philosophically doesn't believe in power. And I had a case where there was I'm trying to remember the ethnicity. It was an ethnic family. They caregiver was like a mother, a sister, and it was the individual, and we proceeded with power. But then we learned later that they never used it. Well, when we were doing follow-up, we learned that father, who was not at the appointment, didn't approve of it. So the context of, we didn't get all the buy-in, or they didn't share with us all the different necessities. So the HAT model looks at taking into consideration all these 3. So the equipment, where they're going to use it, who is going to use it, and then the context. So they give an example of the VOCA versus a language board. So Marion is the individual. She needs a communication device. And when she's with friends in a known environment, she can use her language board pretty successfully. But when she is with strangers or in an unknown environment, she needs a VOCA to help her be successful. So my experience that I've had with this is I had a kiddo that was graduating high school, and everybody predicted not only predicted his needs, but they could really understand him. He was spastic quadriplegia, very dysarthric. And so they knew him enough that they kind of knew what he wanted, but he was preparing for a job. And there's no way that out in the workforce, everyone would be able to predict his needs. So we ended up helping him get a communication board. So I always mess this up. Voice output communication aid is a VOCA. Voice output communication aid. So with Jimmy, we ended up getting a communication board so that he could be more independent and autonomous when he was out in the community. And that didn't mean that he used that same communication device when he was with his friends. He probably went back and forth. But really trying to understand, well, what type of job, how are you using it? And we actually worked with the whole interview process. Heather, the context of this isn't to explain what the VOCA is. It's just to show a more formalized communication device compared to a language board. Did you want to take a stab at that question on how it differs, how VOCA differs from AAC?
It doesn't. It's just a different term.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So other parts of the activity can be your self-care, your productivity, your leisure. This is well known to the OTs. This is like our lifeline. The activity, again, looks at when somebody lacks capacities to complete a task, or the manner in which the task is completed must be changed. So it is what they want to be able to do or need to be able to do that they can't. The human is what is the component of what's not functioning for them, physical, cognitive, or affective. And then, as I said, the context can be a physical context. It could be social, cultural, or institutional. The technology, it could be the specific activity output. It could be the means and how it's being accomplished, or it can be environmental interface. And we're going to go through all of that when we get to the AAC computer access module. So when you look at, this is kind of getting into, this is my to my favorite slide. So I'm warming you up. So you have a referral, you're doing the assessment, really trying to understand what the needs are. And then you do the implementation. Another soapbox of mine is you really need the same people at the implementation that were at the assessment. If you end up, person refuses to come back, or there's a delivery that's in the home, in the seating world, if there's an ATP and an OT at the assessment and the patient just cannot get back, that ATP really needs to be the one to do the home eval. What we see sometimes is the ATP then sends a tech. So you have a tech doing the implementation and they weren't at the assessment. So best practice is really following this process. And then the other piece is the follow-up. So Olga, this is where another one of my soapboxes is that we really need to do follow-up so that we understand if there is something not being met and we need to start the referral again. Follow-up may look differently. A follow-up may be if you have somebody with ALS and they have their annual ALS visit and the team realizes that they have gotten worse and they no longer can use their joystick, well, then you need to get them back into the wheelchair clinic to make sure that we can get some modifications. Follow-up can be a 1 month, a 6 month, a 1 year follow-up. Sometimes follow-ups might be when the person shows up to the vendor for wheelchair for some maintenance. In the non-wheelchair service delivery, the schools my envy is that you do have a team of people that is following the individual. And so even if they may not be directly on the OT's caseload, they may be on the PTs, but you have the school system, the school teachers. I know assets have liabilities and you end up having a lot of cooks in the kitchen, but follow-up can mean a lot of different things. And the other reasons for the abandonment sometimes can be because we're losing track and maybe the need is no longer met. So this is my favorite slide. This is in the Cook and Polgar. This also is a position paper with the service delivery. And so the referral, you first get that referral and intake. Well, this is where you do the assessment. And this is where it may not take one visit. It may not take two visits. It may take a couple weeks. It may take a couple sessions. But the assessment is really part of the overall process. So when you are doing your assessment and analyzing the need, you're synthesizing the information and you're doing the evaluation. If it's not meeting the objectives, then you need to go back and analyze what the problem is. But once you've met your objectives and you've identified what problem you're trying to solve, then you can go to your recommendations and report. The recommendations and report, if you have a situation where there's no funding, then you may try to look for funding, and you may have a little delay with order and setup because you might have a big gap between recommendations, report, and seeking funding. But if everything works good, you do your report, make your recommendations, you seek funding, and you get the funding, then that's where you need to have delivery, fitting, and training. With our AAC, I was finding that the speech therapists were doing the delivery in like the setup of the equipment and then sending them free. And so I looked at them, I said, well, don't people need time? Like once you get past the first set of training, you need more time to do more programming and truly use the whole capacity of the devices. And we've looked at it and we thought, well, maybe. So we started bringing people back for further training, and we've been really successful because we say, go out, get used to these features, and then come back in a month and we'll help you get to that next level. And then the follow-up, as I said, can look a lot of different ways. We have just started doing yearly follow-up, and we're actually getting more buy-in than I anticipated. We're still getting a lot of no-shows, so we have to follow that up. That was a pun. I have to look into that. And then the follow along is also a little trickier, just how to make sure that we're reevaluating them and that we're showing that the devices are still working for them. So I see a hand.
We just have a couple questions.
So Olga, the referral and intake is part of preliminary information to determine a match. Is that the first time the user, the provider, and the therapist meet? It can be. So in my clinic, so if I take my clinic and I look at this, the referral and the intake is the front office. So we get the referral, we get the insurance, we make sure we can take it, we schedule them for the appropriate clinician. In my clinic, I have them meet with the physician and then the therapist to decide what is the need. Then I bring the vendor into the second appointment. The reason I did that was it was wasting the time of the vendor because sometimes that person just needed a scooter and then it was during the competitive bid and they didn't need to be there. So we like to take that first visit without the vendor and then we bring the vendor into the second visit. A lot of clinics will have the vendor with the medical team at the first visit and then deciding what the problem is. So you can do it either way. And I really encourage more than one visit. And that's a whole separate topic that we can talk about. Just because if you're, looking at doing, like with my AAC team, the first eval is just an intake to understand what are the needs. And then they bring them the manufacturer. And I'm pausing because my AAC therapist is pretty experienced. So she doesn't have all the manufacturers on site. She's trained in the equipment. But if she needed, one of the manufacturers there, we would have them on the second visit. We're in the process of assessment as the evaluation by neuropsych for capacity, cognitive ability, medication, determine technology acceptance, capacity, learning. You know, we have a really strong neuropsych team. I have one group that's in the neurology, neuromuscular disease process. I have another group that's in the physical medicine and rehab. When it's a new injury, I do have all of that happen usually before they get to me. So I have a reference of where they're at. If it's somebody with a progressive disease and I notice they may be hitting a point where we need to look more deeply, we will pause and make an assessment. I think that the cerebral palsy, multiple handicap, some of the more orthopedic groups don't benefit from the neuropsych as much as they could. But we definitely have that done before they hit us. Does that help? I can't tell who asked that question. Where does this happen for nursing facility members with 12, 15 months post-injury? So if they're in a skilled facility, I'm going to paraphrase, they're in a skilled facility, they are maybe 2 years post-injury. If the clinical team identifies any red flags or triggers, we'll pause and ask for a neuropsych assessment. In Ohio and in my area, not everyone is covered, so sometimes we have to kind of work around eligibility, but of course that's probably everywhere. I actually use a lot of the neuropsych for capacity for our driving program and some of the safety with driving because it's much more sensitive to the cognitive executive functioning skills than a lot of the clinical assessments. Does that answer your question? And from the chart, it appears that service delivery is anywhere from referral through follow along. Yeah. Yep. And, you know, if somebody stops here and never follows through, we won't just pick up, you know, 6 months, a year later. We'll go back to make sure we still have the same problems. Okay. So now it's going to really break down the provision process. So with the referral, we talked about making sure it's appropriate. If not, refer elsewhere. I struggle with the word appropriate because sometimes on the actual referral, you don't know if it's appropriate. But if they get in front of you and you realize this is not within your scope, we definitely need to refer out. I feel like that's our ethical obligation. Planning the assessment, making sure that the correct team members are there and the proper evaluations are needed. Different clinics and different groups may look differently. You know, I have my children's hospital does a medical clinic in the school system. So they go to the individual because they realize that the family has a difficulty getting to the clinic. So if the clinic can go to the consumer, that's awesome. I don't have that luxury. So we just need to make sure that we are ready for the capacity of the individual. And that's where having that second follow-up allows us to get equipment ready. So when you do the assessment, you know, you're gathering information, you're analyzing the information, you're talking about the goals and outcomes, you're essentially setting your plan of care. We are looking at feature matching, like what characteristics do we want, and then we do a trial with them. The available interventions are looking at what equipment can meet this need. You're going to have weight capacity issues. You're going to have funding conflict issues. I really look at 4, 5, and 6 as trialing the equipment, and then you can make your recommendation. So question is, I saw something about, do you have a payer at the meeting? So BWC case managers will frequently come. We welcome any case manager that wants to come to the appointment. And in fact, I love it for them to come because they can see what we're talking about. But usually they're initiating that. So going through the assessment, you're looking at the how. You want to look at, it's not only the interview of that patient report, I don't always have a ton of records or questionnaires available to me. So I'm doing a lot of observation. I'm doing a lot of my assessments. Sometimes I feel like trial is the best assessment because I could put somebody through a specific like quantitative eval, but I really want to know if they can drive the chair. And so I like doing equipment trials. I've encouraged my inpatient team, if somebody wants power, but you absolutely know that they are left CVA, that they have poor insight, or right CVA, poor insight, left neglect, and you just know they're not going to be safe, still do the trial. You have to be able to let the family members know. You want to control it, you want to keep them safe, but trials are just very, very valuable. And so when you're doing the trials and you're gathering the information, you want to make sure you have quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative data is, those measures. Assistive technology doesn't do very well with the quantitative because we have a lot of qualitative experts that I want this person to have this chair because I have been doing this 25 years and I know this is the best chair for them. Well, insurance says, prove it to me. Prove to me that a titanium chair is better than an aluminum chair and the X amount of dollar difference is worth my money. We've gotten a lot better with using the literature, with using the evidence in the field, but we need to continue to challenge ourselves. So I have every brand of power wheelchair in my clinic. Not necessarily, but I will look at maybe that first visit if I have time and I want to look at a front wheel drive or a mid wheel drive and then I want to fine tune it. That's why I use that second and third appointment, is to bring more equipment in and try out more equipment. Quantitative, a very simple quantitative assessment. If I'm looking at a manual wheelchair and I want to look at how they are pushing a manual wheelchair, a smart wheel was a $10,000+ piece of device about 15 years ago that was really being marketed. We have one, but we hardly ever use it because of other reasons. But you don't need that fancy schmancy stuff. I could take 20 meters and I can have somebody propel from start to finish and I can time them. I can count the amount of pushes and I can look at their style, how they're pushing the chair. And so that will give me quantitative information on it took them 20 seconds to push this chair. It took 10 seconds to push this chair. A wheelchair, if you look at wheelchair propulsion test, there's a really good resource up in Canada that is very well known at the propulsion studies. And there's a form that they provide to you that just summarizes what it is that we just did. Qualitative is I'm defining how this person did it in their environment, and I am, using some observation results of how they were successful and unsuccessful. So the important part of this is be able to use quantitative and qualitative. The exam isn't going to test you on name 5 quantitative tests. We just want to say in the area of assistive technology, we need to get better at providing that standard outcome. So under the assessment, gathering information, making sure you have the appropriate medical and personal information. This is something also, if we don't have it, we'll go and get it. If we know that person maybe can ambulate but shouldn't, but we need cardiac information, we may stop and get that. And that's really what funding wants us to do, is they want us to rule out all other options. And again, that's why we can't do that in one visit. Being able to do a needs assessment and a task analysis. I love the task analysis that occurs with some of the computer access and AAC. We have used the Compass software, and all I know is Heidi is her name, that she did it, but I could get that information for you. So it actually gives you a way of saying, yes, this switch, you were able to use this switch in this manner, that switch in that manner. And so looking for ways of using outcome tests with all the different types of assisted technology. We have a section on sensory abilities. So, looking at someone's vision, looking at their acuity, their tracking, scanning, visual fields, visual perception. We do this really, really well in driving because there's standards that are required for driving. But when it comes to wheelchair seating and AAC and computer access, we need to test ourselves and make sure that we're assessing it properly. Sometimes I do this in reverse. If somebody is having difficulty navigating and driving, they may stop and see, are you having tracking or scanning difficulties? We have a visual field issue. What do we have going on? So sensory sometimes can be a little bit tricky. Thanks, Heather, for doing the compass. Other areas is physical. So, we do this. So if you see what we're doing, we're going needs assessment, sensory, physical. These are all should be parts built into your evaluation. So what are the orthopedic issues? What is their range of motion, not only in the chair, but out of the chair? What is their muscle tone? How much strength do they have? If somebody has maybe 5 out of 5 muscle strength but has really bad endurance and has maybe cardiac issues or respiratory or pulmonary, we need to be able to explain that in the documentation. Coordination, range of motion, these are all parts of a standard assessment. The cognitive part of it, so obviously neuropsych gives a very in-depth, deep, broad, great insight into it, but not everybody always has that. We want to make sure that we're assessing their attention, their problem solving, short and long-term memory, sequencing judgment, so that we know if there's an area we need to maybe do some compensation with. Language, these are my friends in speech, being able to understand, what is the challenge here. Sometimes I'm like, well, get a switch or get something to fix it. But if depending on what their language ability is, technology may not be able to help them. Continuing to understand, well, where are you going to use the chair? Not only where are you going to use a chair, but where are you when you're not in the chair? So are you in that lazy boy? Are you in bed? Where are you spending your time when you're not in the chair? And so I like positions where the equipment will be used and where the information will be used. And I also like where is it not being used. We really, really focus on home in the U.S. And I'm pausing because I see the question. I feel, I'm going to give an answer and then I'm going to let Heather. So I feel as an occupational therapist, I am not trained with a language assessment. And so I need my speech pathology professionals to truly do a formal language assessment.
Yes, that's correct. Speech therapists should be doing that language assessment. And when you're looking at any assessments for like AAC, it should be a speech therapist that has expertise in that area.
Okay, good. I like when I'm doing the right thing. We talked about cultural issues, social issues. Back to the environment of use. I had this little lady, oh my gosh, she was so darn cute. And she was in a really horrible chair. Horrible chair. And so I talked to her. She is an amputee. She had all kinds of comorbidities. So I'm like, we are going to get you a better chair. This chair is going to be so much better for you. And so we talked about, she lived by herself. She had an apartment. Everything was set up for her. But the chair she had was horrible. And so I brought over a trial. We did a trial, and I was just so excited because I felt like that is going to be really make a difference with her. So we finished, and she looked at me. She whispered in my ear, and she's like, "Am I allowed to go fishing?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" I'm like, "Did you go fishing before?" And she goes, "Well, the person that gave me this chair told me I could never leave my home." And I thought, oh my gosh, maybe I wasn't there, so I don't know. But what she heard him say was it was for in-home use. So I explained to her, yes, we do look at in-home use, but we have to be aware of your environment outside. How are you getting from your door to your car? If somebody just needs it for community, and that's where the funding comes in, but just trying to understand where they're using it and getting a understanding of that equipment. We talked about social culture. We talked about family issues. I'm going to keep going here. I like this because what did they use in the past? What are they using now? And what do they see using in the future? As I've been in my career, and followed a lot of my patients, I've seen them age with a disability. You know, when I first started 20 plus some years ago, we didn't know a lot about aging because a lot of people were new with a disability. So one golden nugget that somebody said to me is when I'm talking to somebody that's maybe been using a manual wheelchair for quite some time, let's say 15 years, looking at, well, how do you feel you're doing now compared to a year ago, to 5 years ago? Because people slowly change and have changes over time, that what has maybe worked for them in the past, and maybe they're struggling a little bit now, maybe it's time to have that conversation that we need to look at power add-on or power assist or switching to power. So I really talk a lot about what they have tried and what they're in now, and spend some time helping them understand what their options are. Because the other thing that backfires on me is when they say, I want this exact piece of equipment, and you're sitting there thinking, well, the manufacturing characteristics have changed. I have had people refuse equipment because the style of the armrest was different, that they get so caught up in some of the components. So I really, try, if somebody has a lot of needs and wants, I will have them prioritize that. So this goes into continuing to analyze the information and clarifying the needs. I think with the AAC, understanding, is it going to be, if I have some people that it stays at school and it never goes home, other people that maybe it's more at home and then it never goes to school. We could go through 100 different scenarios, but really trying to understand the environment of use of it. So when you go back through, you have what are the needs and abilities, what is your outcome, what are you trying to accomplish, what solutions do you think are going to help you accomplish that goal, what is the intervention to help you, so what solution and interventions, and then that feedback to make sure that person can use it. So this is a smaller version of the red algorithm, but both of them are going to back to continually assess, is this solving the problem that I'm trying to, solving the problem that is created. So looking at your needs assessment, you want to develop short-term goals, long-term goals, and this is where therapists get a little persnickety because we're doing a plan of care. So if we decide that we really need to do an implementation at clinic and we really want to do training, I like how I use need and want together. If there's a clinical reason why we want that person to come back to be part of the implementation, we really get cranky when the vendors deliver straight to the consumer. On the flip side, it's the end of the year. People's insurance are changing. We have to work together. We have to make sure that we do what is ever possible to help that individual get their equipment before their insurance changes for the end of the year, or we have to start the assessment again. So team consensus is huge. And we also help the consumer know that, hey, you know what is today, October 29th? When we call you to say, your chair is ready, we need you to get in. It might not be the ideal time, but we need you to be aware that we all need to work together. We also need them to cooperate and get the home eval and all those other pieces together. I don't know, with Heather, with AAC, do you guys get that end of year rush that we do with seating?
I work mostly with the schools in that area, and it's all year. I mean, spring is definitely the biggest time, for fall and spring, because fall when schools, schools are just getting back in a session, and then spring when IEP season, that's a busy time.
IEPs, I've heard about that season. Okay. So all working together is the important part. So looking at your goals, is your goal to improve function, to improve health, to improve safety, comfort, and making sure that the goals are measurable so that when you are at the implementation, you can go back and say, yes, we accomplished what we set out to do. So defining desirable features before you select the equipment, we talked about that with the feature matching, and looking at what are the solutions. The second bullet, I feel like we're just trained in making sure that the least costly alternative or the simplest device without getting too crazy. High tech is fun. It's out in the media. Everybody wants it, but we need to make sure that we're ruling the lower, more cost-effective options. And like I said, the pros and cons. If someone has a lot of needs and wants, write it down. And sometimes they're going to have to give, and sometimes we're going to have to make a decision. And I am a little bit obsessed with certain tires, but I know that's a big funding issue. So sometimes if I have a really restrictive insurance company, I'll go through and back down on some of my components that I think are really, really important. But getting your consumer to work with you on making sure that they're bought into it. So, then you start getting into the intervention of choice and the equipment and the training. New injuries are, a little easier because they're really dependent upon the experts, but they're also hard because if something goes wrong, it's your fault. People that have been experienced users of equipment have enough to know what they like and don't like, but sometimes still have unrealistic goals. So really understanding that we're all on the same plan. And if you have that case manager there, I just think it makes it easier because they're seeing what we're asking for on paper. So the recommendations hopefully are always in a report, but sometimes it could be a prescription or a letter of medical necessity. Sometimes insurance companies have their own forms. We have C9s for workers' comps. There's a lot of different pieces and parts. We partner with our school therapists because we'll do the documentation, and we partner with them on, they really, obviously for the environment and the function, and they see that person every day, but we will partner with them and collaborate together so that we take the burden of the paperwork off of them. So then you get to the ordering, the setup, the delivery, fitting, and that's where the team that was at the assessment should be at that implementation. We talked already that follow-up looks different in different places, and we just need to make sure that that person has that safety net if things aren't working. So some measures are important because I hinted to this with the quantitative and qualitative, but if you have a consumer saying, well, how has the solution worked for others? So, if I'm a new injury and I'm trying to decide, well, should I get the power add-on? And, the ATP is saying, well, will this intervention accomplish the goals? And the suppliers say, well, will the product features meet the consumer's needs? And the payer is always looking at funding for most effective. So making sure that we have objective ways of answering these questions gives everybody greater confidence. We always want to make sure that we are evaluating the end result against a predetermined set of standards. And we want to make sure that we have objectives for each of our goals. Olga, is there one individual who's responsible, I lost your question, the go-to for write-up recommendations and delivery? So in my model, in my clinic, we have, so the clinician is the lead for making sure we're gathering all the information in the intervention. So the physician provides the medical piece of it. The clinician provides the functional. The supplier works with the clinician in all the feature matching, so like the componentry. And so they'll give us a sheet. For instance, if they say, okay, Teresa, we need a harness, they'll give me all the specific coded devices, and I'll work with them on writing it up. And I am the one responsible. Then I give that write-up to the physician who signs off on it, and then we pass it to the supplier. The supplier is the one responsible for getting funding and ordering the equipment. So once that equipment comes in, really the delivery and the fitting, if you go back to the service delivery guideline, if there is something wrong with that equipment, it needs to be returned to the manufacturer. The supplier is the one that is responsible for that equipment. From a clinical standpoint, my clinical judgment, I'm responsible for the functional use of that equipment. So it really is a partnership between me as a clinician and the vendor for the equipment. But if you go through that service delivery, it really defines the role of the supplier and the role of the clinicians. More in the U.S. Centric. Outside of the U.S., a lot of times the vendor and the therapist are the same role, and you don't have that separation of duty. And Olga, I'd be happy to talk to you more about service delivery. It's kind of my geeky topic that I love talking about. But we're going to go ahead and keep moving on so we can respect time. So when we're writing outcome measures, we really want to be specific. We want to include the end result, the action, the task, the qualifiers, the acceptance level. So, you know, I want a manual wheelchair propulsion. I want them to be able to push 1 meter per second so they can cross a crosswalk in a safe time. So if I say that I want an ultra lightweight wheelchair so that person can push their chair effectively, well, I need to say the qualifiers and the acceptable level. We really want to avoid opinions and vague statements. We want to be objective as possible, use quantifiable measures, and make sure that we have before after. My favorite thing is to say, without this piece of equipment, here is what would happen. So with Jimmy, without a communication device, he would decrease his chances of getting hired because it's highly likely that people won't be able to understand him. So he needs that communication device for successful employment. So I went through like how long you're using it, how far you're using it. You want to be able to do quantitative as far as measurable, but then you can use qualitative to really define that performance component. You know, effectiveness and efficiency. I love using that manual wheelchair to cross the street before the crosswalk, turn so that they don't get hit by a car. And then the patient satisfaction. A lot of outcome measures in the outpatient are what's called patient-reported outcomes, and it's those patient satisfaction. There's a functional mobility assessment, which is the FMA, and it talks about consumer satisfaction with mobility equipment, and it looks at how satisfied are they with the equipment to be able to meet their daily needs. So we're using that a lot. Don't know if we're at the point where it's really, we're using it as strongly. We're still trying to gather a lot of that information for the outcomes, and there's more and more publishable information, but FMA is a patient-reported outcome tool. So the part 2 for outcome measurements is, looking at skill development over time. So helping that person, S as in Frank, M as in Mary, A as assessment. So it's functional mobility assessment, FMA. Assistive technology, it's tough to find norm reference measures. So if I want to say what is the most efficient chair for a 32-year-old female with T10 para, we just don't have that right now. But the more and more we're getting proficient in outcomes, the closer we are to being able to have some of those measures. And the clinical guidelines is really the powerful tools that we have, and those are all Resna guidelines. We're not going to write outcome measures. Close your eyes. Okay. So, oh my gosh, it's 8:29. We're actually doing well. Any questions before I hit the test, and then we'll take a break? No? Okay. You guys are going to have to help me here because I can't see it. So I launched the test for assessment. Can anybody see it? Wait, I didn't launch it. Now I launched it. Okay. So you should be able to see the assessment test. I'm going to give you guys just a few minutes to do it, and then we'll go ahead and close it, review it. We'll take a break, and then we'll come back for access. Okay, 70% of the people submitted, so I'm going to go ahead and close it. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Sorry, I'm away from my phone. Close it. Test is closed. This isn't what I want you to see. Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to share. Oh, review it. So many buttons. Now share. Okay. If a client referral is inappropriate, what's the next step? 84% got that refer the client to an appropriate provider, and that is the correct answer. So A, see the client anyway and do the best you can. You may start seeing the person and then realize you are not the provider, and so then you refer. So the important part is do the best you can would not be the best answer. B, tell the client you're unable to meet their needs. So that's not wrong, but that's not solving it because we need to help them get to where they need to go. And then ignore the referral is clearly not the one. So for the exam, going back and seeing what is the question. So first half is it's not appropriate, but what's the next best step? So B, there is no next best step. So just telling them you can't meet their needs. So that's why C is a better answer. Again, I don't know the test. I'm just trying to give you some problem-solving strategies. An outcome measure, 71% answered, evaluates the end result against a predetermined set of standards over a period of time. So an outcome measure evaluates an end result of your set of standards over a period of time. So it's not an opinion or prediction of outcome because it should be facts. Measures function before or measures function after. It's not C or D because you need to be able to compare it to the pre and post. Probably thinking back, I should probably emphasize that a little better in the verbiage, but 71% is pretty good. Pretty good. Okay, so it's 8:34. Do you guys want to take a 5-minute break? If you were not able to take the exam, it doesn't affect you at all. It just didn't give you a chance to test your knowledge. So you can go ahead still and just take it in your, thinking through it. I don't know why it didn't pop up. I was kind of delayed in finding the buttons to get it to pop up. So if you want to give Charlie a holler to see if there's anything specific, feel free to do that. Okay, so 8:40, we'll reconvene.
The one I want? Yes. Oh, they don't eat? Yeah. It's the base place for everything.
Okay, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so our next topic we're going to do is access methods for assistive technology. Hopefully. There we go. Okay, so our learning objectives for this next section is to identify major principles and goals for access, identify the steps in assessing a client's access needs, and identifying features of the different types of technology. So first we have our characteristics of technology that are available to meet our clients' needs. And we are going to be looking at 4 major things when we're looking at this. So if we're thinking back about that Cook and Hussey's hat model that Teresa talked about, we have the human, the activity, and the assistive technology, all right? So first is that human and technology interface, and that interaction between the human and the technology. And this interaction can be one way, it can be 2 ways. Typically, you're going to see 2 ways, right? So I'm typing into a computer and I'm getting some type of output. So I have an input and output. This is just telling us how we interact with, right, the technology. The next piece is the processor, and this is kind of the inner workings, of the technology. And the easiest way to think about, the processor is just thinking about a computer, right? A computer has a processor, and every piece of technology that we're going to be working with, including even low tech, right, it has some type of processing component to it. And then we have our output. And this can be a visual output, it can be auditory, it can be tactile, right? So what does our keyboard give us? It gives us a visual output because we can see the letters. It gives us a tactile output because we can feel the keys depressing. And it also gives us auditory when we can hear the clicking. So we can get all kinds of output. And then we have the packaging. So what does the device look like? And that's important to our users, right? What does it look like? Because they all want to know, right? What does it look like? Is this something that I'm going to be comfortable using? So specifically for that human technology interface, a couple things we need to think about. That input device, the control interface, right? How are we going to control the technology? And we're going to talk about some different control interfaces. What's the selection set or the symbol set, right? Is it letters? Is it pictures, right? And then we need to also think about the presentation layout or the arrangement of the keys. So thinking about your keyboard, right? You have a specific layout of that keyboard, but there's different types of keyboard layouts. So that's another option. And then there's the selection method. So how are we actually going to select what we need in that technology? So we're going to talk about all of those components. So let's talk first about control interface and how we classify them. So one way to classify the input devices is by the amount of control that is offered, right? These control interfaces are listed from those that offer the least amount of control to those that offer the most. So which controller to use is based on the consumer's abilities and the type of devices that are going to be controlled. And a control interface with discrete inputs is one in which each location has a fixed value. So our discrete input things are such as switches, single switches, switch arrays, so multiple switches, keyboards, and speech, right? They each have a fixed value. A continuous input control interface has ongoing input with an infinite number of values. So 2 examples of that would be like joysticks and mouse emulators. Think about your mouse. How many different ways can you move the mouse? How many different things can you access with that mouse? When we're talking about switches, right? So that was the first discrete, was switches, right? There are basically 3 types of switches. We have momentary, latching, and timed. So for momentary, the switch is only on as long as it's being pressed. So think about, like a doorbell, for example. That's a great picture to show that momentary. When you release the switch and that connection stops, the output of that switch stops. So cause and effect, right? We can set up a switch stop, right? Let's say a bubble machine. And we put in momentary, when we hold down the switch, it produces bubbles. When we release the switch, it stops making bubbles. And I see a hand up. Do we have a question? So I'm not sure who that is. It's just coming up as, there we go. Okay, hand down. Oh, hands back up. Okay. Okay, so then the next switch type is latching. So every time the switch is activated, its state changes, right? So activate the switch and the current goes on. So the device goes on. Activated again and the current or the activity or the device goes off, right? So thinking about a wall switch. So turning your lights on and off would be considered a latching device. And then the final one is timed. And when you activate the switch and the current goes on, right, the electricity, the device goes on for a certain amount of time and then turns off. So thinking about it, just a standard timer, right? So those are the differences: momentary, latching, and timed. So momentary, I have to hold it down in order to activate. Latching, I can turn it on and off. So I could hit the switch to turn it on, hit the switch again to turn it off. So again, if we're talking about the bubble machine, hit the switch, I'm going to turn it on, and I can release the switch, and it's going to continue making, producing bubbles. And then I'm going to hit that switch again, and it's going to stop. And then with timed, I can set the timer, the switch interface timer, so I can hit the switch, and then it's going to produce bubbles, let's say for 30 seconds, and then it's going to automatically turn off. And yes, George, time switches are great. That's a great way to do to work with our kids with the timed. Okay, so single switches. So let's talk about, so we had single switches, we had switch array. So we're going to talk then about the difference between those. So single switches offer the least amount of control and provide only two options, right? It's either on or it's off when you're activating a switch. Now, if we attach it to a timer, right, a time switch, then we have a little more flexibility. But when I'm hitting the switch, it's on. When I'm releasing the switch, it's off. So what we're seeing here in the pictures are two examples of single switches. Like the top picture shows a wobble switch, which can be activated in any direction, but no matter what direction they are pushed in, the same single switch output is generated. And then the round switches can be pressed anywhere on the cap of the switch to generate a switch closure. Lots and lots of different types of switches available. Almost a type of switch for each body part, right? So we've got foot switches, tongue switches, eye blink, eyebrow. We have switches in multiple sizes and shapes and sensitivities, and what is required for them to be activated, such as their force and they can have sound feedback and the conductance that's available for them. So lots and lots of different switch options available out there. Next in our discrete is the switch arrays. So switch arrays are just a set of single switches that have been put together or packaged together, and each switch sends its own single message or signal. The important features of switch arrays are the number of switches, the size of the switches, the type of switch, the type of activation that's required from the switch, and the sensitivity, for example. And the position of the switches is going to be relative to each other. So for example, if you look at this switch activated stereo up in the top right corner of the slide, the middle one is our play button, and then I have my go back and my go forward buttons. So just like in your, think about your car radio, you have the play and pause, and then you have, the skip forward or skip back buttons, and they're always going to be in those positions. This positions of the switch is also going to be relative to the packaging, right? So some consumers can accurately access the switch if it's recessed into the casing. So if we look at, the electronic head array for a wheelchair headrest, right? We can have switches that are built into that headrest, right? So a lot of different ways that we can do switch arrays where we're just activating multiple switches to do multiple actions. So like, for example, the switch array for the wheelchair headrest, well, I could have, let's say, maybe I have 2 switches in there, and one could be to switch over to my communication device, where another switch then switches me back to my wheelchair functioning. So there's different, each switch is going to have its different functions. The next thing in that discrete input option then is keyboard. So remember, we're moving from least amount of control to the most amount of control. So next is our keyboards. And we have standard keyboards, you have your laptop keyboards, but we all generally use the QWERTY keyboard layout, okay? But there are a lot of different types of keyboard layouts, so we need to keep that in mind. There are a lot of different keyboards that are available out there. So we have our standard keyboards, we've got mini keyboards, we've got enlarged keyboards, we've got ergonomic keyboards, so a lot of different versions of keyboards out there. So, and this just shows, if I'm going to type the word typewriter, just all the different places that my fingers need to be going. So if I do not have that nice standard, typing with both hands, all of my fingers, that's standard typing access, then I need to think about, like, maybe I only have one finger that I'm using, or maybe I can only use my right hand, or I can only use my left hand. Is this keyboard layout going to be functional enough for me? So that's something we need to think about. Some other types of keyboards that are out there. Here we have the BAT keyboard, and this is going to be a one-handed keyboard, and it's also called a chorded keyboard. So you can see there's very few buttons. So think about creating chords on a piano keyboard where you're doing key combinations with a couple of different fingers. That's what you're going to be doing on a chorded keyboard. So on this BAT keyboard, where I'm going to be doing different button or key combinations in order to do my typing. And the BAT keyboard comes in left-handed and right-handed options. You've got half QWERTY keyboards, so it's just a part of the keyboard. So again, it's going to be a lot smaller. It's going to be easier to use for a one-handed typist. And then you have things like your big keys keyboard, where you have nice enlarged keys, and some of these have like 1-inch square keys, so they're nice and big. So if we have especially like a younger student with fine motor issues, this is a great keyboard. And if you also notice, what's different about that big keys keyboard is it's not in the QWERTY layout, it's actually in an alphabetical order layout. The next type of input then is joysticks. And joysticks come in 2 types, proportional and non-proportional. So proportional is in which the amplitude or the strength of the signal relates directly to the amount the stick is deflected. So they're commonly used with power wheelchairs to control both direction and speed. So the harder I push on it, for example, like if a wheelchair, the harder I push on it, the faster I'm going to go. Same if you're using a joystick for as a computer mouse. The harder I push on it, the faster that mouse is going to move. Non-proportional is a set of 4 or 8 switches within that joystick, each correlating to a specific direction and activated by deflecting that stick in that direction. So think about like almost like a compass, where you have north, south, east, west. For my 4, and if it's 8, I'm adding in the like northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest. So now I have 8 ways, and I can only move it in those 4 or 8 directional areas. but it cannot tell how far it was deflected. So if I'm pushing really, really hard forward, it doesn't matter. It's not picking up the force that I'm using to push in order for, like, for example, if I'm using it on a wheelchair, it's not going to go any faster. So this particular slide shows a head-controlled proportional joystick and an attendant-controlled digital joystick. So these are also different. They're also different types of grips. So there's a ball grip, there's a goal post, there's a T grip, for example. So the joysticks, they're all going to have different configurations. So it doesn't have to be what you're typically used to with that handle with the joystick. Lots of different ways for that gripping. All right, next is mouse emulators. Okay, so we have standalone mouse emulators. We have our power wheelchairs. The controls can be used as a mouse emulation system. So I can use that power wheelchair joystick to emulate a mouse control on a device, which is really, really cool. And then we can also use speech generating devices or augmentative communication devices for mouse emulation. So specific dynamic systems like a Tobii Dynavox or a Pranky Romic, they are going to have some built-in mouse emulation, so I can use mouse control on my screen. Okay, so we have talked about some different types of technology. So let's keep going here within our process. So we're going to keep looking at all of these different areas here. So next is our control interface features. When we're thinking about the actual control interface, right, we need to be thinking about all of these different things. The number of targets, so thinking about a keyboard, how many different targets are on the keyboard, all those different keys, right? A QWERTY keyboard, it's a lot of keys, a lot of targets. The specific target size, right? So is it a standard keyboard? Is it a large keyboard? Is it a mini keyboard, right? So what are the sizes of those keys, for example? That's my target size. Looking at the overall dimensions of the selection surface, right, that incorporates all of those targets. So thinking about, again, a standard keyboard, right? What's the overall size of that? And then that incorporates all of my individual keys. So we need to think about, that overall size of that keyboard, and is, my range of motion for my user, is that keyboard size a good size for them? We need to look at spacing between targets. Why is that important? Well, if I don't have really good fine motor control, the spacing between the keys on a keyboard, for example, is going to be very important, because I may or for example, if I have tremors, I may accidentally hit the wrong key, right? And then we have key guards that help us isolate all of those keys. Next is the activation method. Can I use direct selection, use my fingers, right? Or a head pointer or a mouse stick, right? Or something where I can directly activate or directly interact with that device. What type of feedback is being provided by that device? Am I getting a tactile feedback? Am I getting auditory? Am I getting a visual feedback? And which one of those are important for that user? And then obviously we need to think about durability. How long is it going to last? If we're working with younger students, or maybe adults with a propensity to throw items, because we've never ever encountered a client that does that, I hope. That's going to be a big thing, durability. So if it falls on the floor, or if it's, accidentally gets thrown, how durable is that product? The next thing then is activation methods, right? How are we activating those devices? Is it going to be a movement? So for example, is it going to be a head movement, a hand, finger movement? Is it going to be foot? Is it going to be knee? Is it going to be elbow? What movement is going to be, are we going to use in order to activate that? How much force can the person exert in order to activate a device? Does it need to be sip and puff where I'm using a straw type device where I'm sipping and puffing air? Really, I'm just kind of like moving air around in my mouth to activate it. All right, so question is, when using iPad, is target size controllable by keyboard or mouse, whereas proprietary equipment is limited by actual physical hardware? The iPad does have the ability to change the keyboards on there. So for example, you have the QWERTY keyboard, you can change to like a Dvorak keyboard. So you have some control with the keyboard and some of the target size, because you can change in the iPad, same with on the iPhones, you can change to like more enlarged, so you can have larger buttons, but you don't have too much control about with the space between those targets, so between the keys. But you can also get key guards for iPads. It just depends on what program you're using. So there is a little bit of control with the iPad, but not as much as you would with like the physical keyboards. Okay. Next then is our speech recognition or sound. So our voice dictation, which is becoming more and more prevalent. It's becoming built in to a lot of our computer systems, which is really nice. We have our EMG, so our electro muscle. So we can place a switch on a muscle or a tendon, and then just by simple movements, for example, eyebrow, I can't, and sorry guys, I'd be showing you, but for some reason my camera's not working tonight, but I can put a switch like on my eyebrow and just simply by moving my eyebrow, or I could put one on my hand, and by just doing real small movements, it's picking up those muscle movements. I can do eye gaze, and we can use camera systems. We can use all kinds of, Tobii Dynavox probably has the best eye gaze system that's out there, where the cameras are built into this eye gaze, and it's following the movements of my eyes in order to operate the mouse on a computer or an augmentative communication device. There's different sensors that we can use, and there's also actually brain interfaces as well that can help control. So, percentage of population using eyebrow or muscle twitch. That's a good question. I don't have a number, a percentage of population using that. I would say that's going to be, from my experience, typically a little bit lower. We want to look at other access methods before we go to like eyebrow or muscle twitch. But if you think about like individuals with ALS who are a little more progressed in their disease, they're going to be using like eyebrow and muscles twitches, some spinal cord injury, eye gaze and muscle, and some muscle twitch as well. Different sensors, Olga, they're going to be similar to like that EMG. So we're looking at, you know, the eyebrow, the muscle. So they're just sensing different movements. And we have proximity, where we're just gauging like just movement. So that's the kind of sensors. And I can get some more information on those later for you guys. Okay. Oh, there you go. We've got an answer. About 15% of the population. Awesome. Okay. So here's a couple of different examples of, you know, movement activation, where these are different joysticks. Oh, you're asking. Yeah, I don't know for sure what percentages it's out there for eyebrow muscle twitch. I mean, I can look that up and see if I can find an answer for you guys for next time. Okay, so these are just different types of movement activation. So again, just joysticks and just, you know, forward, back. Again, like the proportional and non-proportional, right? So I either have full access, like range of motion with my joystick, and it will move as fast as I'm, you know, based on the amount of pressure and force I'm activating it, or I have my 4 to 8 points of movement. And then I have force activation, where I have to put a little more effort behind activating it. So if I have an individual who is very forceful with their activation, they really push, right? They can push really hard on something, but they have a hard time pulling back. It's going to give me some nice force activation. So something where I really have to put some effort behind it. Here's that sip and puff. Here's some different examples of that where I'm just using breath within my mouth. And it's really just, changing the air pressure. I don't actually have to use it like I would use a straw to drink. I can just literally puff my lips or my cheeks out, and just to change the air pressure. So it's very, very easy to use those. And then the different types of voice activation. And obviously we have our software programs like our Dragon, our Via Voice, but then we also have Google, right? Our voice typing within our Google. We have voice typing built into our Windows and our Mac computers, as well as our tablets. So, thinking about when we're texting, we can hit the little microphone and we can, dictate our messages. Here's that EMG activation. So I'm just using those muscles to activate my devices. Here's that eye gaze. So again, you can see the camera down at the bottom there. And that's an older picture with the camera, but it's a nice picture because it really makes it really obvious that camera, now they tend to be a little more streamlined. All right, so the question is, who uses sip and puff? A lot of individuals with spinal cord injuries are going to use sip and puff. I've seen some individuals with ALS use sip and puff. So basically somebody who has very limited hand or upper body movements and has limited head movements as well is going to use a sip and puff. Okay, here's the sensor activation. So as you can see, we're just moving. So thinking about yeah, our picture on the left there. Yes, that guy is, the question was that guy shooting a gun with a sip and puff? Yes, he's shooting. I don't know if that's a gun or if that's, yeah, I think that's a gun. Or is it one of those crossbows maybe? So sensors, so I'm just like moving my body weight, right? So these are good examples of sensors where I'm moving my body weight to move the device and operate it. Yeah, there you go. Teresa said you can sail a boat with a sip and puff. Yeah. That's cool. And here's the brain interfaces where I'm connecting into my brain waves in order to activate different devices. So I know at one point, actually this was a while ago when I was in graduate school, they were actually developing brain interfaces so that people could drive a car just by thinking about it. And I was like, oh, what if you get distracted? That would be not fun. Okay. All right, so we already did all of those. I'm not sure why we have a couple of slides in here that are duplicating. All right, so, but we need to, again, we're just going to reiterate with this slide. Again, we need to think about how many targets is the individual able to access, what size do they need to access, what size device in general. So like, for example, a keyboard, what is just the best example there. What size keyboard are they able to access surface-wise because of range of motion, fine motor control? What type of spacing do we need between targets because of fine motor control? What type of activation are we looking at? And then also the feedback and durability. The other thing we need to think about then is our symbol sets. So in order to indicate to the consumer what choices a control interface offers, pictures, letters or words, or tactile markers are often displayed on the controller. Okay, so thinking about, like a keyboard, right? It has letters, right? For consumers who are visually impaired or physically impaired, choices may be presented auditorily. And there are examples where no symbol set is displayed. So thinking about your typical wheelchair joystick, right? You don't necessarily have, letters or pictures or any auditory cues, but some of them are going to have some beeping going on. They're going to have some light displays for different things. Here we go. Here's somebody that said that they have a lot of residents in their facility, a lot of people with MS who use sip and puff or a combination with a head array. It's perfect. And question, is there no room any longer for cardboard with letters and yes, no, pain, hunger, thirst, so that everyone has to be in the electronic age? No, you absolutely, you can still use picture communication boards with just letters or pictures on it. Those are still being used. The low-tech eye gaze, where it's just like a clear piece of plexiglass with options on it. Low-tech with that type of thing is still absolutely still used today. And a lot of times that's the first thing we use, is that low tech. Yep, and exactly. We use low tech a lot when the high tech decides to quit working on us. Can you use sip and puff for expressive language? Yes, you can use sip and puff to access communication devices. You can use it to type on a computer. You can use it to activate different choices on an augmented communication device. So yes, you can use sip and puff to access all of that for communication. All right, next then is our presentation layouts. All right, so we talked about target size and target, and this is now our location, right? How are we presenting it? So the arrangement or presentation layout of the symbol set can be very important to the efficiency of the user and how they're using it. The frequency of use layouts place the most frequently used choices in the easiest or fastest to access locations. So fast choices may be placed sequentially from left to right, top to bottom, to help ease a cognitive load of sequencing steps of a task. And the layout may also have a spatial relationship to the choice, such as in a joystick or other directional controller, where the choice which generates a right turn is placed on the right side. Makes sense, right? So thinking about, your QWERTY keyboard, why are the letters configured the way they are? Well, if it was in alphabetical order, it's going to be a little more difficult to have a fast typing speed. So the QWERTY layout was specifically developed with that configuration of letters for a faster typing speed when we're using the two-handed method. So next then is our selection methods. Okay, so how are we selecting, right? So the two selection methods are direct and scanning, and we're going to go through both of those. Direct selection, so thinking about things like as keyboarding or speech recognition, and then we have coded. So we'll talk here about coded. But keyboarding, obviously, that's specifically typing on a keyboard. You're directly selecting the buttons. Speech recognition, I'm speaking, so it's directly in providing what exactly I need to be communicating. And then coding, and they have in here Morse code. So coding. Now, if I'm doing Morse code or I'm using like a computer system, this is so old. As you can see, copyright 1989. Morse code can be either direct selection or indirect selection. If I'm using switches to create Morse code, it's going to be an indirect selection. In this particular program that I don't know if it even exists anymore, but programming, so coding such as like computer programming, that type of coding, that's going to be considered more of direct selection. And I don't know, anybody out there use that type of coding or any kind of coding? I don't really see this used a whole lot anymore. And then we have a hand up too. Oh yeah, I'll say Yeah, there you go. We do coding now in schools, right? Coding, so you're learning how to do computer coding, but using coding, for example, to right, make their own games, that kind of thing. But in order to, for like communication specifically, I'm not seeing Morse code being used like it used to be used. Okay. All right, so then the next type then is indirect selection. If we go back, let's just go back real quick to direct selection. Another type of direct selection, so we have keyboarding, we have speech recognition. Eye gaze is actually direct selection as well, because I'm looking directly at what I want to be selecting. Okay, so that's another one that's not listed in there. And then our next, this one then is indirect selection, so scanning. So using switches to scan selections is called indirect selection. So because I have to go through a process in order to get to my specific letters or words or pictures that I'm trying to select in order to communicate. With scanning, there's three main types that we can use. There's a couple others out there, but three main types: item by item. So one, I'm scanning through things one at a time. I'm gonna show you some examples here of how it works. You've got group, item, or row column, and then having or quartering. So we'll go through those. And then here's some of our presentation formats for scanning as well. We've got linear, we've got circular, and we've got group. So linear is just in a straight line. Circular, so this is an example of circular. So thinking of like, I always think of like a radar machine, like in an airport, you see the radar and you see the dial going around, right? That's circular. So it's going in a circle, or if you think about like a clock and the hands going around, it's circular. And then you have group. So it's going to do a larger group. So if you think about taking your computer screen and blocking it into 4 different sections, the top left section is one group. The top right section is going to be a group. The bottom right and the bottom left are going to be other groups. All right, so let's talk about row column and how this works. So this is just an augmentative communication device showing the lights that are on there, right? Look at all of the different buttons that are out there. And if I want to get to my specific choice, I have to scan through each row, and then I have to scan across each column. So thinking about this like a table format, having to go down one column at a time and then over one row at a time in order to get where you need to be. So here's the example, right? So first I'm scanning down my rows, and then when I get to the row that I want, I hit my switch, and then I have to scan across the columns. So it's a very slow and tedious process. So here's a little demonstration, right? So we need to get to the X, all right? So the rows are highlighted in sequence, are going to be highlighted in sequence from top to bottom, okay? And then when the row containing the X is highlighted, the person is then going to activate their switch again. So they're going to activate their switch to start the scanning, and it's going to scan the top. And then it's going to keep scanning. There you go. And then when it gets to my X, I'm going to hit my switch again, and now it's activated the X. So X marks my spot that I wanted, right? And that's how that scanning process works. Okay. For group, row, column scanned, I can then do it by, again, we're going to start by group. So in our top column, top left picture here, you can see the blue highlighted area. That's the group. And if I need something within that group, so my ultimate goal is the glasses. So when it scans or highlights that group, I'm going to hit my switch. It's then going to move to row column scanning. So what we just did, it's going to start at the top row and move down. So as soon as it gets to my row where my glasses are, I'm going to hit my switch. And then when it moves over to the column where my glasses are, I'm going to hit my switch in order to activate it. There are different selection techniques when we're doing the scanning. We have auto, which is when the indicator scans in the preset pattern on its own, and item selection occurs when the scanner hits a switch. So it automatically is doing the scanning for me, and then I'm just activating my switch when it gets to where I need it to be. Then you have inverse or directed, and the indicator will only scan in the preset pattern when the user holds down a switch. So it's opposite of auto. Auto, it's automatically going. Inverse, I have to hold the switch down and then release the switch when it gets to where I want it to be. And then we have step, where the user controls each movement or steps through the process, the scanning process, right? By activating the switch each individual time. So to select an item, the user hits a second switch once the indicator reaches his desired item. And because of the constant switch activation, this method might be too fatiguing for certain scanners, including those with ALS, but it is an easier process cognitively to work through that step process. We can also customize our scanning method. So parameters for customizing the selection method to the user's needs include the scanning rate, right? We can speed up or slow down that scanning rate. And the question is, usually step technique needs 2 switches. Yes, it does need, typically we use more than 1 switch in step scanning. There is a way to do step scanning with 1 switch, but it's easier to understand when you're using 2 switches. So typically we're going to use 2 switches. The next selection method that we can customize is the acceptance delay, and this refers to a delay which determines how long a selection must be held before it is accepted. Okay, so for example, if I'm holding down my switch to activate, and let's say I release too quickly most of the time, I can have it set up so that I have to hold it down a little bit longer in order for it to release. Or if I have, let's say, cerebral palsy and I have, some spasticity, and I might hit, button a couple times by accident, I can hold it down longer for it to activate. We have repeat delay, so how long the computer or the device will the key is held down before it begins entering that key repetitively. So that is actually a good one on computers. So you can actually activate that on your computers. It's the key repeat. So if I hold down, let's say if you've ever been sitting and thinking about what you're going to type and you didn't realize you had your finger down on one of the buttons, and then you look up and you have, like, let's say the letter J going all the way across your screen. The repeat delay will prevent that from happening. So after so many seconds, it will then actually say, oh, you really wanted that letter, and it will then activate that. And we've got timeout or auto entry delay, or called dwell is the other way to call that. So how long the assisted device waits until it automatically accepts the current choice as the final selection. And dwell is typically used with eye gaze. So when I'm looking at the letter that I want to type, it's going to wait a certain amount of time while I'm looking at that particular letter. And you can adjust that wait time or that dwell time. Okay. And we have about 5 minutes, so I'm going to get through as much as we can, and then we will pick up where we left off with the access on Thursday. Okay. All right, so principles for access. We need to look at the positioning of the consumer and the equipment. Very, very crucial. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that our person is in a good, stable position. Then we're going to start looking at what positions, where, like, different activation points once they're in that position. Once they're in a nice, upright, secure position, are they able to use their hand? Or maybe they have better control with their head, or maybe they have better control with their knee. So we're only going to look at the positioning of the equipment once the consumer, the person has been positioned. We also need to look at ergonomic and biomedical principles during this, and this is a good time to, definitely bringing in our OTs in the process of finding our good switch location. Ultimately, our goals for access, it needs to be acceptable to the person. Is this a good location for this switch? Are they okay with that particular switch? Are they okay with, accessing it with their head or their hand or their knee or maybe even their foot? We want to make sure we provide access that's consistent, it's reliable, and it's reproducible, so that I can always, for example, tilt my head in that same position in order to activate my device. Oh, and I can do this over and over and over again consistently. Not easily subject to error. So if I do have a lot of spasticity and movement, I want to make sure that wherever my switch is placed, that I'm not going to be accidentally activating it on, constantly. I want to make sure I'm minimizing abnormal tone. So again, if I, have, for example, cerebral palsy, am I placing the switch in a place that's going to activate, that high muscle tone? That's not a good thing. So we need to then look at a different location. And we want to make sure we avoid using like reflexive patterns. So make sure that I'm not putting that switch. So for example, if the user tends to have that ATNR that Teresa talked about last week, I don't want to put a switch in a location that's going to activate that pattern. Okay. And we want to make sure that we have backup or secondary access methods in place. So if the user becomes fatigued, what else can they do? How else can they activate their device so that they can continue, for example, interacting with the computer or continuing with their communication device? For the assessment, a couple things we need to look at are is the controllability, so we need to look at their the sensory components that are involved, their cognitive capabilities. Do they understand the cause and effect components of activating, for example, a switch or using a mouse or using a joystick? And then also their physical capabilities. Are they able to access the computer, for example, using a mouse or a joystick, or do we need to be looking at eye gaze? So those are some different things we need to be thinking about. And I think this is probably going to be our last slide here. Let's see. We have a couple slides for controllability, so let's see if we can get through them here. So we also need to be looking at the sensory. So their visual, their auditory, and their tactile, right? Their somatosensory. So visual, can they visually see what we want them to activate? Do we need auditory feedback, or what else we need to do for tactile? Do they need tactile feedback from, like, for example, from a switch or from a joystick or from a mouse? Do they need that feedback so that they understand that this is, what's that they're actually activating it? So then for cognitive, we need to be looking at memory, sequencing, problem solving, right? And then for physical, what's their range of motion, the resolution, what's their strength, what's the, endurance level for activating, let's say, for example, a switch over and over and over again to communicate. Are they able to repeat that action over and over again? And then what's the, versatility? Do I only have one access point that I can use, or do I have multiple? All right, I think that's going to do it for tonight. And then on Thursday, we will pick up. We don't have a whole lot left with access. So we will pick up on Thursday with the rest of access. And then we will go into, I believe it's service delivery on Thursday. So any questions so far on that access? Okay, so we will stay on for a couple minutes. So if you have any questions on access, we can answer them. I'll see if I can find a percentage of that muscle and twitch and eyebrow usage. And we will see you on Thursday at 7:30.
What's that question, Heather? Seems like mode.
Yeah, seems like mode was selected before assessment. Isn't that backwards? What are you? Michael, the test will be on Thursday when we finish this. So I'm not sure where you're seeing that mode selected before assessment. I think it's just the order of the slides. Obviously, we're going to be doing the assessment before we select the mode. I think it's just the order of the slides that maybe has you confused. Let's see here. Who would be using eye gaze? I've seen spinal cord injuries, ALS, cerebral palsy, all of those types of disabilities using eye gaze. Assessment does determine the access, so that is definitely very crucial. It's just for whatever reason the slides are just in that particular order. So, but yes, we definitely do assessment before we determine access. Alrighty, I think that's it. I think we'll go ahead and stop.
Can you stop recording, or do I?
Looking.
Go under screen share. I got it.